Grand Fleet Overseer Yannick Thess had commanded the Voranth Compact's third expansion fleet for 19 years, and in all that time, he had never once received a diplomatic response that confused him quite as thoroughly as the one currently displayed on his command, the Compact's ultimatum to the newly discovered human civilization had been, by any reasonable standard, generous. Cede the 3 contested systems along the perimeter corridor, accept status as a compact protectorate, and Earth would be permitted to retain internal self-governance under Voranth oversight. Terms considerably more favorable than the compact typically extended to species. It judged too weak to negotiate as equals, which every intelligence assessment gathered over the preceding 11 months confirmed humanity to be. Earth's response when it finally arrived consisted of a single sentence, transmitted with what compact translation algorithms flagged, almost apologetically, as an unusually casual tone for a formal diplomatic exchange. We'll send someone to discuss it. Give us a few days. 3 days later, a single vessel departed Earth's solar system, designated by human communications as ISS Halcyon, bound for the negotiating coordinates the compact had specified. Thess reviewed the ship's specifications as it approached, and found himself, not for the first time in this encounter, genuinely uncertain how to interpret what he was seeing. One ship, he said, more to himself than to his assembled staff. They received our full military ultimatum, backed by an assembled fleet of 60 capital ships, and they responded by sending exactly 1 vessel to negotiate. Perhaps it's a diplomatic transport, overseer, suggested his intelligence officer, Cressa Van. Unarmed, intended purely for negotiation. Our scans indicate otherwise, Thess said, studying the Halcyan's energy signature with mounting unease. Whatever this vessel is, it isn't unarmed, and our analysts can't fully explain what half its onboard systems are, actually, for. What troubled Thess more than the ship's ambiguous capabilities though, was something considerably harder to quantify, the brief visual transmission accompanying the vessel's arrival, showing its captain and entire crew preparing for what should have been, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily tense negotiation with a fleet more than 60 times their own numerical strength. They were smiling. Captain Marcus Webb had spent the 3-day journey from Earth, doing something his crew found, by their own admission, somewhat unsettling in its calm, reviewing old military history rather than obsessively analyzing the Voranth Compact's fleet specifications. "You're not worried, Captain?" asked his executive officer, Commander Priya Anand, watching Webb close a well-worn tablet displaying accounts of historical negotiations conducted from positions of apparent weakness. "I didn't say that," Webb replied. "I said I trust the people who built this ship, and I trust the plan we spent the last 4 years preparing for exactly this scenario. Those aren't quite the same thing as not being worried, Commander, but they get the job done well enough." The Halcyon, unlike the vast majority of human vessels, the Voranth Compact's intelligence services had catalogued over 11 months of careful observation, had been constructed under a classification so restricted that fewer than 200 people across all of Earth's governments knew its true capabilities. Publicly, it was registered as an advanced diplomatic and research vessel. In practice, it represented humanity's most significant strategic investment since first detecting the Compact's approaching fleet nearly a year earlier. A single ship, built not to match the Compact's numerical superiority, which no reasonable timeline would have allowed, but to fundamentally undermine the assumptions the entire Compact's approach to interstellar diplomacy had always relied upon. "They're going to expect fear," Webb told his assembled crew during the final briefing before their arrival at the negotiating coordinates. Every species the Compact has approached with an ultimatum like this has responded the same way, either desperate capitulation or a doomed show of conventional military resistance. "We're not going to give them either, we're going to give them something their entire negotiating strategy has no framework for handling. Genuine, unshaken confidence, backed by exactly the kind of capability they won't be able to properly assess until it's far too late to change their approach." The formal negotiations, held aboard Overseer Thess's flagship 3 days after the Halcyon arrival, began with the same carefully calibrated intimidation the Voranth Compact had successfully employed across 41 previous first contact negotiations. An extended tour of the assembled fleet's weapons capabilities, delivered with the polite, unhurried confidence of a civilization that had never once needed to follow through on the implicit threat. Such demonstrations carried, "I trust you understand the scale of the force currently deployed within this system," Thess said. Once the formal proceedings began, watching Captain Webb's expression carefully for the fear or desperation that typically accompanied this stage of negotiation. "The Compact would prefer a peaceful resolution, Captain Webb, but I want to be certain your government fully appreciates precisely what alternative exists should these negotiations fail to produce acceptable terms." "I appreciate it entirely, Overseer," Webb replied, his tone remaining as unhurried and genuinely relaxed as it had been throughout the tour. 60 capital ships is an impressive show of force. I imagine it's worked well for you in your previous 41 negotiations, something in Webb's phrasing. The specific, confident reference to a number the Compact had never disclosed to humanity through any official channel caused Thess's carefully composed diplomatic expression to falter, almost imperceptibly, for the first time since the negotiations had begun. "You are familiar with our negotiating history," Thess said. It was not quite a question. "We've done our research, Overseer," Webb said. "Same as I imagine you've done yours on us. The difference, I suspect, is that our research went considerably deeper than yours did, and we've had a bit more time to prepare for this specific conversation than you might realize." What Overseer Thess did not yet understand, and what Captain Webb's calm, unhurried demeanor throughout the negotiations deliberately obscured, was the full scope of what Earth's intelligence and scientific communities had accomplished in the 11 months since first detecting the Voranth Compact's approaching fleet, rather than attempting to match the Compact's conventional military strength. An effort that even the most optimistic projections confirmed would take decades humanity simply did not have. Earth's Unified Defense Council had authorized an entirely different strategic approach, built around a discovery humanity's own scientists had made nearly 2 years earlier. In the course of unrelated theoretical research into the Compact's own well-documented history of expansion, every civilization the Compact has ever approached has negotiated from the same fundamental weakness. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Defense Council's chief strategic analyst, had explained during the initial planning sessions that ultimately produced the Halcyon and its unusual mission. They negotiate, based on what they can prove, in the moment, about their own capabilities. And the Compact, having built an empire spanning 61 star systems on the strength of consistently overwhelming force, has never once needed to develop a negotiating strategy for an opponent whose true capabilities they genuinely cannot verify. The Halcyon, DAR's design, and the broader strategic doctrine surrounding its deployment had been built entirely around exploiting that specific gap. Rather than demonstrating overwhelming force, which humanity simply did not yet possess in sufficient quantity to credibly threaten a 60-ship armada, the mission's planners had instead focused on cultivating deliberate, carefully calibrated ambiguity, ensuring that whatever the Compact's intelligence services managed to observe about the Halcyon's capabilities would raise more questions than it answered, forcing Overseer Thess into a negotiation where he could never be entirely certain what he was actually dealing with. "We don't need them to believe we're stronger than we are," Chen had told the assembled council in the final strategic briefing before the Halcyon's departure. "We need them to genuinely not know how strong we are, and to understand that any aggressive move on their part carries a risk they cannot properly calculate. Uncertainty, applied with enough confidence behind it, can accomplish things pure strength sometimes can't." 3 hours into negotiations that had grown steadily more tense as Overseer Thess found himself increasingly unable to predict Captain Webb's calm, unhurried responses to what should have been overwhelming pressure, the Compact's chief tactical officer, Cressa Van, requested an urgent private consultation. "Overseer, I've completed a more thorough analysis of the Halcyon's on-board systems, Van reported, her voice carrying genuine unease. Several of its energy signatures don't correspond to any weapons or defensive technology in our threat database. I cannot confirm what these systems do, but I also cannot rule out that they represent capabilities considerably beyond anything we've previously encountered from a species at humanity's apparent stage of development. Your assessment then? Thess asked. My assessment, Overseer, is that I genuinely do not know what we're dealing with, and I am increasingly uncertain whether that uncertainty is the result of insufficient analysis time or a deliberate strategic choice on humanity's part to ensure we remain uncertain. It was, though Van had no way of fully confirming it in the moment, precisely correct on both counts. The negotiations concluded, 4 days after they began, with terms considerably more favorable to Earth than the Compact's original ultimatum had proposed. A mutual non-aggression agreement, covering the contested perimeter corridor systems, formal recognition of Earth's full sovereign status rather than protectorate designation, and a framework for future diplomatic and trade relations, negotiated as equals rather than as conqueror and subject. Overseer Thess, reviewing the final terms before his formal sign-off, allowed himself a rare moment of direct, unguarded curiosity toward Captain Webb, whose calm confidence, throughout 4 days of high-stakes negotiation, had never once wavered. I find myself curious, Captain, now that these proceedings have concluded, Thess said. Was your confidence throughout these negotiations built on genuine capability? Or was it, as I've come to suspect, primarily a calculated performance? Webb considered the question for a long moment before answering, with the same easy, genuine warmth that had characterized his entire approach to the negotiation. I think the honest answer, Overseer, is that it doesn't really matter which one it was, does it? You negotiated fair terms either way. That's really all any of us were hoping to accomplish here. It was an answer that would trouble Overseer Thess for years afterward, in ways he found difficult to fully articulate, even to his own senior staff, a nagging uncertainty about whether the Voranth Compact had negotiated with a species genuinely possessing capabilities beyond their understanding, or one that had simply understood, with remarkable clarity, exactly how to make an empire's own assumptions about strength work against it. Back on Earth, in the aftermath of a negotiation that had reshaped humanity's standing among the handful of interstellar civilizations now aware of its existence, Dr. Sarah Chen offered the assessment that would ultimately define the mission's place in early human diplomatic history. They spent 41 negotiations learning exactly how to make weaker species afraid, she told the assembled Unified Defense Council. We spent 11 months learning exactly how to make a stronger civilization uncertain instead. Fear tells your opponent precisely how much power you have, because it requires proving that power to be effective. Uncertainty doesn't require any proof at all. It just requires never quite answering the question directly, and letting your opponent's own imagination do the rest of the work for you. Captain Marcus Webb, addressing his crew in the quiet aftermath of the Halcyon return to Earth orbit, offered a considerably simpler reflection on the 4 days that had, against every reasonable strategic expectation, secured humanity's sovereignty against a fleet 60 times its own strength. They kept asking themselves why we only sent one ship, he told his crew. And I think the honest answer is, we never needed to convince them that one ship was enough, we just needed to make sure they could never quite be certain it wasn't. Turns out, against an empire that's never once had to negotiate from genuine uncertainty, that's sometimes worth a great deal more than an entire fleet. The Halcyon remained humanity's most closely guarded strategic asset for years afterward, its true capabilities never fully disclosed even to the Compact diplomats who continued visiting Earth in the years that followed. A quiet, permanent reminder that the difference between weakness and strength, in the delicate calculus of interstellar diplomacy, sometimes depends less on what a civilization can actually prove about itself, and more on what it can convince a far older, far more powerful adversary, that it simply cannot afford to assume. Word of the negotiations' outcome spread quickly through the loose network of species connected to the Voranth Compact's diplomatic sphere. many of whom had endured far harsher terms under similar ultimatums in decades past. Several of those civilizations, having lived for years under the assumption that resistance against the Compact's overwhelming numerical superiority was simply a mathematical impossibility, took quiet, careful note of a small, previously unknown species that had walked away from a 60-ship Armada with its full sovereignty intact, having fired not a single shot and revealed, when the final accounting was done, remarkably little about what it had actually been capable of the entire time. Overseer Thess, in the years that followed, would occasionally find himself revisiting the recordings of those 4 tense days of negotiation, searching them for some definitive clue he had missed, some clear signal that Sci would finally quiet resolve the question that had quiet followed him through the remainder of his career. Whether humanity's calm, smiling confidence had been earned by genuine strength, or simply by an extraordinary understanding of how much power could be borrowed from an opponent's own uncertainty, he never did find a satisfying answer. Perhaps, as Captain Webb had suggested all along, it had never really mattered which one it was.